Hello, okay, welcome to the video on conservatism and human nature. Essays on this, you would probably argue that traditional and one nation conservatives, and actually social conservatives agree, social conservatives too, they tend to agree largely on human nature. They've got like a common view, although there are subtle differences between them. Whereas the new right neoliberals, Rand and Nozick in particular, tend to be seen to disagree. So you'll probably argue in an essay that they agree to some extent, although the new right tends to disagree. However, there are subtle areas of agreement and disagreement amongst the three or four different strands, which we will hopefully cover. Okay then, so traditional and one nation conservatives tend to agree that humans are imperfect. Humans are flawed. We are flawed intellectually. So traditional conservatives like Burke and one nation conservatives like Oakeshott believe that we're not rational, we're incapable of making rational decisions, we're too given by emotion, and we can't therefore understand the full consequences of ideas and decisions which we make. Thomas Hobbes to some extent agrees. However, he does argue that we have some rationality because we are rational enough to recognise that we need to have a state with authority over us. So we have some rationality because we recognise that we can't live in the state of nature and therefore we need to have some kind of state, some kind of authority over us. However, Hobbes, Burke and Oakeshott largely agree that humans are imperfect. What they tend to disagree on is the measure or the extent of that imperfection, I suppose, and just how bad it is. So, if we look at Hobbes there, his famous quote is that in the state of nature, life will be nasty, brutish, and short. That's a very famous quote from Leviathan, which is the book which Thomas Hobbes wrote. You got to bear in mind a little bit with Hobbes, though. He was writing at the end of the English Civil War, where he'd seen, thousands of people have been killed in England, complete anarchy and disorder during that 10 years. So you got to kind of put him in some kind of contest as to kind of where he was from, and therefore some kind of authority, some kind of order, no matter what it was probably preferable to the anarchy which he had witnessed in the 1640s. Anyway, so the state of nature will be nasty, brutal, and short. He argued that people desire power over everything else, and that people are individualistic and ruthless in that desire for power, and will quite happily stomp over someone else's rights, someone else's interests if they are weaker. As I said before, humans are intellectually imperfect, okay? We don't think in a rational way. We tend to work off our impulses, although there's the caveat with Hobbes that we are rational enough to recognise that we are horrible people, basically, and we need some kind of authority to keep us in line. Psychologically imperfect as well. We tend to rely upon tradition. We don't particularly like change. We don't understand kind of relationships with others, and therefore we tend to rely on tradition as a way of kind of guiding us through life. So Thomas Hobbes has quite a bleak view of human nature. Again, I think it's coloured by the English Civil War, but anyway. Now Burke is often seen as the father of conservatism, and this is because Hobbes does recognise we have some rationality, which some therefore say, is he really a conservative? Burke, though, he agrees in principle with Thomas Hobbes' quite bleak view of human nature, although he's less bleak, I suppose is one way of putting it. He thinks, for example, that humans are not perfect, humans are flawed, but he doesn't quite see us in this kind of individualistic, ruthless kind of desire for power. Burke argues that humans make mistakes, humans don't understand the full consequences of decisions which they make, but he also argues that people kind of recognise this, and this is why people tend to band together in kind of communities. So I suppose he would kind of see the state of nature as kind of people banding together to form alliances and relationships with each other as a way of trying to make their way through, I suppose, the state of nature. So he disagrees on the kind of individualistic ruthlessness of Hobbes, although he does agree that humans are irrational, Okay, probably more so than Hobbes actually. He does argue that people are not rational, people are psychologically imperfect and intellectually imperfect. And again, like Hobbes, this is why we need tradition and we need authority, because it keeps it on the straight and narrow, I suppose. Michael Oakeshott, One Nation Conservative, he's more in agreement with Burke than Hobbes. So, like Burke, he rejects this kind of very bleak view which Hobbes has. He rejects the idea that the state of nature will be nasty, brutal, and short. Oakeshott said it will be noisy, foolish, and flawed, which I might say is slightly better than nasty, British, and short, I suppose. Like Burke, he says that humans are intellectually flawed and that humans are psychologically flawed as well. In fact, Oakeshott has quite a strong streak about psychology. He says that conservatism is more psychological. He argues that humans are fragile and fallible. In other words, we're weak and likely to make mistakes. Like Burke, he says that humans cannot make rational decisions, or our ability to make rational decisions is very limited. And as we said before, we are psychologically flawed, and because of that, we like to band together in communities, and because of that, we don't like change. So Oakeshott and Burke, Oakeshott being a One Nation conservative, Burke being a traditional conservative, they're pretty much in agreement, I would argue, over human nature. You can see that they get some of their ideas from Hobbes, but they're a bit less bleak than Hobbes. Hobbes is kind of bleak central, isn't it? Burke and Oakeshott are a bit more kind of, we're not particularly nice individuals, but at least, we're not quite as bad as what Hobbes argues. Okay, when we come to neoconservatives, they tend to agree with the traditional and One Nation conservatives. So they argue, again, that we're psychologically flawed, and we're morally flawed as well. So for neoconservatives, their main concern is about our morality, and they argue that humans are prone to irrationality, being immoral, and therefore we need strong authority figures like the church and the state to kind of keep us on the straight and narrow. Now, the new right, the neoliberals from the new right, i.e. our friends Ayn Rand and Nozick, they disagree with the other conservatives. In particular, Oakeshott, Burke, they particularly have a disagreement with. There is some argument to say they have some similarities with Hobbes, I'll try and tease out some of those similarities in a few moments. So, the new right, they disagree with Oakeshott and Burke in particular, and to some extent with Hobbes, because they argue that humans are actually rational. Very much like liberals, hence why they're called neoliberals. So they disagree that we're irrational and incapable of making rational decisions. Rand and Nozick believe that we are rational. Humans can make rational decisions and do make rational decisions, and they tend to do it for their own self-interest. Now, the bit with their own self-interest links a little bit with Hobbes, because Hobbes says that we're rational enough to recognise we need authority. So there's a slight agreement between Rand and Nozick and Hobbes, although I think largely you would probably say in an essay that Rand and Nozick disagree with One Nation and traditional conservatives. They have a much more rational view of human nature, which is very different to the other conservatives. They've also got a slightly more positive view of human nature as well. I mean, the view of Hobbes is bleak, plus, isn't it? Oakeshott and Burke are not exactly positive about human nature, whereas the new right, the neoliberals anyway, Rand and Nozick, have a much more positive view of human nature. They do agree with Hobbes that in the state of nature, humans would be individualistic and ruthless. So there's an agreement there with Hobbes that in the state of nature, we are basically nasty individuals, I suppose. But they have a much more positive view of that. They argue that that's not such a bad thing. The fact we are selfish, the fact that we are ruthless, the fact that we're individualistic, Hobbes sees as a bad thing, Oakeshott sees as a bad thing, Burke sees as a bad thing. Rand and Nozick don't. They say that's a good thing, actually. That's what drives the economy. People being individualistic and ruthless free competition between people. That's what brings out the best of humans and kind of brings out, the growth of the economy and competition and all these various things. So the very things which Hobbes and co sees as being bad, you could argue that Rand and Nozick sees actually being quite a good thing. Okay. That said, Nozick does acknowledge that that can get out of hand, and therefore you do need a state and some authority to just try and keep us kind of on the straight and narrow, I suppose. Quite a small state, but a state that does that nevertheless, which again has some echoes with Thomas Hobbes' view that we need to have some kind of state. So, oh yeah, and the New Right also agree, by the way, with the other conservative key thinkers, that it's, trying to create some kind of utopian society is just pointless. It won't work. So again, they do have that element of pragmatism in that aspect as well. So to sum it up then, traditional conservatives, Burke in particular, and One Nation conservatives, Oakeshott, think that we are flawed, think that we're intellectually flawed, morally flawed, and psychologically flawed. Hobbes agrees with that as well, although he takes it to a further extreme that we're really flawed, I suppose. The New Right, the neo-liberals anyway, Rand and Nozick, who we focus on in particular, they argue that yes, we are flawed, but that's not actually such a bad thing. The biggest area of disagreement amongst all the conservatives is that the neoliberals, the New Right, Rand and Nozick, have a positive view of human nature, and they think that we're very rational. Oakeshott and Burke think that we're not rational. Hobbes thinks we're not particularly rational, although we're rational enough to recognise that we need a state. So I hope that's cleared up. I do quite like human nature and conservatism. Perhaps it's just me. I think it's quite interesting the subtle differences between them. Hence why I make quite a good essay, because you can argue areas of agreement, areas of disagreement. It's up to you whether you think those disagreements are really big and massive or fairly small. I think, as an overview, I would probably say that traditional and One Nation are kind of in agreement. They just differ on the extent of, how horrible we are, whereas the neoliberals are very much on the positive side, aren't they, which are quite different to the conservatives. Although there are, which would then be your counter-arguments, I suppose, there are a few kind of weak kind of similarities you might point out between Hobbes and Rand and Nozick. Okay, I hope that helps. The next video I'll do on conservatism, I'll either do tomorrow or possibly at sometime next week.